And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who I will note is different than on the schedule and has saved Friday for him this week with his generous offer to come down. Fred Tsao is the Senior Policy Counsel at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. In this position, he provides technical support, trainings, and presentations on immigration-related topics to service providers, immigrant community organizations, and others who work with immigrants. He also provides updates and analysis of changes in immigration policies and procedures to IRAIRA members and allies, and assists with the Coalition's legislative advocacy efforts. A self-described recovering attorney, Fred practiced law at the Rockford office of the Prairie State Legal Services, where he worked after receiving his law degree from the University of Michigan. He has also worked with the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois, the Chicago Anti-Hunger Federation, and the Missouri Public Interest Research Group. A native of Chicago, Fred is the son of immigrants from China and has had a lifelong concern with immigration issues. Please join me in welcoming Fred.
Okay, thank you, Casey, and thanks everyone for being here. I am obviously not Alexandra Felindra, but I'm pleased to be here nevertheless. I want to start off by saying a word or two about my organization. The Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights is the state's largest multi-ethnic immigrant advocacy organization. We are mainly based in Chicago, but we have member organizations and allies throughout the state, including the University Y and the Refugee Center, which is a few blocks away from here. I myself have been with the organization for, it'll be going on 19 years in January, so I'm older than I look. I should also say that ICRR is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization, so I may not be in a position to be as freewheeling as Alexandra may be. That's because I don't want to lose our tax status. But hopefully I'll be able to provide some significant amount of insight regarding immigration issues, particularly as they pertain to the elections next month. So, obviously immigration has emerged as one of the kind of cutting-edge issues in this year's campaign, and I don't necessarily say that in a good way. We've witnessed huge amounts of invective being hurled at certain communities, particularly Latinos, Arabs, Muslims, even refugees, questioning their loyalty to the United States, the loyalty of people people of these ethnic groups or their descendants, and questioning whether it's even safe for refugees to be here in the United States. We've heard calls to build the wall and to undertake mass deportations. We've even seen heated rhetoric regarding linking immigrants with crime and drugs and lost jobs. What I hope to do in the next half hour or so is offer a reality check, to spell out what exactly is the situation with immigration these days, and how does this create a context for the elections that are happening now, and what are the potential scenarios that could emerge from the elections, and then finally, what we all can do, win or lose, regardless of the outcome of the elections. So, let me start by talking about the legal immigration system. So much of the conversation is focused on, undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants. By the way, I don't use the term illegal because no human being is illegal. So I'm going to use the term undocumented. So the legal immigration system that we have has existed for about 50 years, and it basically channels people into different categories who are eligible to lawfully immigrate to the United States. Unfortunately, pretty much ever since this system was created, we've seen very long backlogs, even among the people who qualify, and then huge swaths of people who just do not qualify. So, for instance, someone who's trying to immigrate based on a family relationship may face backlogs of 5 years, 10 years, as much as 22 years. That's the backlog for siblings of U.S. citizens who are trying to immigrate from the Philippines. My boss is the son of Filipino immigrants. He has an uncle who waited outside the United States the entire 22 years in order to immigrate lawfully. The same kind of situation applies to people trying to immigrate based on work. If you're a university professor or a very skilled artist or professional or a business executive, the path is much easier because the immigration system has a bias toward people with high levels of education or skill or professional experience. People who don't have such levels of skill or education are not going to have such an easy path, largely because employers are required to do a search for workers in the United States, in order to find people, to fill the particular position they're trying to fill before they can even sponsor someone to immigrate to the United States based on work. So obviously, lots of less educated, lower skilled individuals are going to be excluded from the immigration channels, even though there's certainly demand for their labor. So when people say, well, why don't they just get in line? Very often there is no line to get into, and then once they get in the line, if they qualify, those lines tend to be very long and very backlogged and take quite a long time to clear. Now, there are other laws that set the context for what we're dealing with in immigration. We just marked the 20th anniversary of a couple of laws that have had significant impact on immigrants. The one I'm going to talk about in more detail is the Illegal Immigration and Immigrant Responsibility Act, or IRAIRA, which was signed into law September 30th, 1996. So obviously we just marked the 20th anniversary of the enactment of that law last week. This is a law that essentially made it much, much tougher for immigrants to come into the country by setting up much more stringent bars on who qualifies and disqualifies broader categories of people, including individuals who are already here in the United States. They may lack lawful status, but they may qualify for a visa based on a family relationship or an employment sponsorship. If they proceed outside the United States in order to process their visa and then come back into the country lawfully, they could be setting themselves up to be barred from the United States for 3 years, 10 years, or even permanently. And this was a creation of IRAIRA. IRAIRA also made it much easier to deport immigrants already in the United States. Specifically, IRAIRA broadened the categories of criminal offenses that could subject, convictions for which could subject someone to deportation, and in many more cases without any recourse, without any kind of waiver or consideration of how this person has conducted his life since the conviction. That's all out the window. Finally, IRAIRA limited the rights of review for potential appeals. So, for instance, if someone who's coming into the United States could be, if they're caught, they could be summarily excluded from the United States by a low-level immigration officer without any kind of hearing whatsoever. Now, I should point out, IRAIRA was passed 20 years ago in the context of another period when immigrants were under assault based on a number of different instances. You had the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. You had the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. You had the enactment of NAFTA and the subsequent peso crisis in Mexico, which drove many Mexican farmers off their land and into the cities or closer to the border regions or over the border. And one manifestation of the mood created by all these developments was Proposition 187 in California, which limited the ability for undocumented immigrants to get public education and public benefits. Now, I should point out here that Prop 187 was set the tone for another federal law that was passed in 1996, welfare reform, that ended up disqualifying many lawful immigrants, legal immigrants, from getting the nutritional or income support or medical assistance that they may need. I should point out here, under federal law, undocumented immigrants do not qualify for most means-tested benefits. So, kind of as a back consequence, many legal immigrants ended up getting hurt. Now, I should mention as well that, as another piece of the context that we're dealing with, we have seen an upsurge in immigration enforcement activity going back 9 years, starting with the administration of George W. Bush and continuing throughout the Obama administration. Currently the federal government spends $18 billion on immigration enforcement. $11 billion of that alone is on the border. The Border Patrol is now the single largest law enforcement agency in the United States, with roughly 20,000 agents. We also have a physical barrier on much of the border. We have a wall. Now, the wall is, has been constructed on 700 miles of the southwest border with Mexico. Well, the border between the U.S. and Mexico is 2,000 miles long. Why isn't the rest of it being built? A number of considerations, largely environmental considerations, or the area is just too remote. Few people would even try to cross in those areas. When people call for building the wall, well, ask them to visit El Paso or San Diego and take a look at what's up there. The wall is there already. We've also had record numbers of deportations over the past several years, peaking out about 4 years ago with 406,000 deportations taking place that year. To give you context, that is twice the population of Aurora, Illinois, being deported in 1 year. The total numbers of deportations just under the Obama administration is about 2.5 million. Now, that trend has decreased somewhat over the past couple of years, largely because people like me, people like my coworkers, and many of the people we work with have raised such an uproar over so many people being uprooted, their families being torn apart, by deportation. Let me also add that the United States government detains 34,000 immigrants on any given night. 34,000 people. That's the population of Danville. Okay, that's this is actually a congressional mandate that the Department of Homeland Security maintain 34,000 detention beds. Beds to detain immigrants who are being processed for removal. Now, 2/3 of these beds are being operated by for-profit companies. I could go off on a very long jag about the for-profit prison industry, I will not at the moment, but I'd welcome questions about that. But basically, let me just leave it at leave that topic by saying that these are for-profit companies that essentially profit off of each individual who is being detained at one of their facilities on any given night. We've also seen over the past few years increasing numbers of people who are fleeing Central America, because of the violence and gang activity in that country, and that in itself has created a demand, a perceived need for further detention on the part of the immigration authorities. So, after a few years when ICE had finally done away with family detention centers, ICE has now reopened or recommitted to detaining entire families at 3 facilities throughout the country. And these facilities are generally in areas where they're far away from larger communities. There's very limited access to legal assistance and other resources that can support these families. ICE has also undertaken a series of raids against many of these Central American families who basically were rushed through the deportation process largely without legal assistance, and who ended up with deportation orders. Now this new wave of raids, which began back in January, has of course caused major panic among immigrant communities more generally. They may be wondering, well, what if I'm caught in the wrong place at the wrong time and ICE shows up? So many immigrants are already living in a state of apprehension over this renewed wave of ICE activity. Okay. We have also seen over the last few years record numbers of criminal prosecutions for immigration status offenses. It is a criminal offense under federal law to enter the United States unlawfully, and particularly to re-enter the country after a previous deportation. So thousands of individuals are being criminally prosecuted in what's called Operation Streamline, which basically involves large cattle calls of individuals who are being brought before judges and basically pressured into accepting short jail terms with the threat of longer jail terms if they don't agree to a plea bargain. And then they are then being housed in further for-profit detention facilities, while they're serving out their terms. We've also seen increasing entanglements between immigration authorities and local police, through programs like Secure Communities, and the Criminal Alien Program, such that now when a criminal suspect gets arrested and their fingerprints get taken, all of those fingerprints not only go to the FBI, they also go to Homeland Security. This enables Homeland Security to identify individuals who are of interest to them, and in many cases request that the police or the jail hold these individuals until ICE can pick them up. Now, I should say here in Champaign County, thanks to the work of Ricardo Diaz and lots of other leaders with the Champaign-Urbana Immigration Forum, the sheriff does not cooperate with the immigration authorities, making Champaign County one of 2 counties in Illinois that does not cooperate with immigration. The other county, of course, being Cook County, where I'm from, Chicago. However, policies like this are coming under increasing scrutiny and attack, by elected officials and even from the Justice Department. You'll notice, if you've read the Republican Party platform, they specifically single out so-called sanctuary communities or sanctuary cities for particular, particular sanction should the platform be enacted. Now, one thing to point out here with respect to criminal activity, again, you've heard so much rhetoric regarding immigrants and crime. What's actually happening is that crime rates are lower among immigrants and in immigrant communities. And some of the safest communities in the country are communities that are on the border. So, one very strong example of that is El Paso, Texas, which is right up against the border. It's across the river from Ciudad Juarez, which is a particularly dangerous city. Yet El Paso, Texas, has a very low crime rate. So, go figure. That I hope should debunk a lot of the mythology that is out there with respect to immigrants and crime. We've also been seeing lots of whipped-up rhetoric with respect to Muslim Americans. This is driven by some fairly high-profile incidents outside the United States and Europe, but also in the United States, regarding certain radicalized individuals who act out. But unfortunately, these incidents are being used to essentially tar entire categories of individuals who are now feeling under attack. And that includes individuals who are fleeing a very dangerous part of the world, the Middle East, in order to seek safety and protection against the very radicals who are causing the trouble. Now, we have seen some governors throughout the country who have tried to block resettlement of Syrian refugees in their states. I'm ashamed to say that that's editorializing. Let me back that up. Among those governors is our own Governor Rauner, as well as the governor of the neighboring state, Mike Pence, who has been getting a lot of attention recently. I should note here that the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled that Governor Pence does not have the authority to block refugees from being resettled in Indiana. This was decided just this past week. Let me make one other observation in my reality check here. The undocumented population is actually falling. So the current estimates are that there are approximately somewhere between 10.5 and 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. This is actually a decrease from the levels that we had in the United States, up through the past decade or so, when it probably peaked at about 12 million. Now, why is this happening? One huge reason this is happening is because immigration from Mexico is flatlining. This pattern actually began with the economic downturn of 2008, 2009. Many undocumented Mexicans who were in the United States were no longer able to find work. They went home. And people who may have considered coming up in order to find work stayed. Throughout all this, the Mexican economy is continuing to develop, so job prospects in that country are increasing. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our own policies, particularly with the construction of the border barrier and the ramp up in the personnel of the Border Patrol, has had some impact as well. But the long and short of it is, the numbers of undocumented Mexicans is plummeting, and that's reflected in overall declines in the numbers of undocumented in the United States. Now, what's that leave? It still leaves quite a number of people who are out of status in the United States, and it's estimated that roughly 2/3 of those individuals have been in the United States for 10 years or more. So what's that mean? Well, if you're living in a country for 10 years or longer, very likely, first off, you've found a way to survive. You've found some work that you're able to do. In most cases, you would have, you'd have a family, and chances are you'd have children. Those children are most likely going to be U.S. citizens. You may have bought a home. You may have founded a business that may itself be hiring individuals and supporting the economy. Well, chances are, if you're doing all that, you're also paying taxes. It's not remembering the exact figure, but undocumented immigrants pay tens of billions of dollars in taxes each year, federal, state, and local. It's been observed that taxes paid into the Social Security system by the undocumented are essentially keeping Social Security afloat, in large part because while those immigrants remain undocumented, they're not going to collect benefits. Okay. So I've painted a pretty bleak picture so far. I do want to say that there have been some positive developments over the past few years. I should note that much of all this that I've described has happened under the administration of President Obama, in whom many people I work with had fairly high hopes of some positive changes to the immigration system. And to his credit, President Obama has made several attempts to protect the undocumented. There was a serious run at immigration legislation back in 2013 in the wake of President Obama's reelection and the severe losses among Republican candidates of Latino and Asian voters. 2/3 of Latinos, three-quarters of Latino voters and 3/4 of Asian voters voted Democratic in the last presidential elections. And the GOP went through a good amount of soul searching. They commissioned a report known as the autopsy report that said that they have to do a much better job of appealing to communities of color, and one way of doing that would be passing immigration reform. So that set the context for the attempt to pass reform back in 2013. The bill passed on a bipartisan vote in the Senate, but unfortunately the House leadership chose not to move it forward, and the bill ended up dying. Even before then, you had an attempt to pass the DREAM Act in 2010. The DREAM Act would, of course, being legislation that would benefit immigrants who came to the United States as children and who want to be able to continue on with their educations and careers. The DREAM Act fell a few votes short of passing in the Senate back in 2010. That prompted many immigrant advocates and leaders to push the administration to do what it could to protect individuals who would benefit from the DREAM Act. That led to the DACA program in June 2012. Which to date has benefited 800,000 undocumented young people, many of whom, quite a number of whom I know. They're studying, they're working, they're contributing to our community. They've emerged as leaders in many cases. Now, the administration did try to expand DACA and create another program, a parallel program called DAPA, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents, back in November 2014. Unfortunately, those programs have been enjoined by litigation, and just this past Monday, the Supreme Court refused to rehear the lawsuit that they deadlocked on this past June. So now that lawsuit is going all the way back down to the district court in Texas for potential further developments. And in the meantime, unfortunately, all those individuals who would be eligible for the DAPA program or the expanded DACA program are, remain undocumented or remain unprotected. So that brings us to today and the current elections. So obviously we have candidates and party platforms that are very different in their approaches toward immigration. You know, the Republican platform, the Republican candidate and the Republican platform, which has probably gotten much more attention, largely because their rhetoric has been so inflammatory, includes elements such as ending the DACA program, building the wall, toughening up enforcement, creating a deportation force. It's not clear what that means. Denying federal grants to so-called sanctuary cities, conducting extreme vetting of refugees and other people seeking admission to the United States. Again, I don't know what that means. Imposing further restrictions on legal immigration and renegotiating treaty obligations and trade deals. This last point might not seem related to immigration, but it actually does, insofar as if we disrupt trade regimes, that could cause individuals to want to leave their countries of origin and try to move elsewhere, and that could include the United States. So as a friend of mine puts it, we can deal with people over there or over here. Take your choice. The Democratic platform is, takes a very different approach. It would, it calls for, a renewal of efforts to pass comprehensive reform, similar to the 2013 bill. It would expand the DACA program and probably build upon what would have been the DAPA program. It would repeal some of the specific bars that were created by IRAIRA. It would target enforcement on individuals with criminal histories and factor out individuals who don't fall into those categories. It would curb collaboration between immigration enforcement and local police, and it would end the use of for-profit prisons. Now, so two very stark choices here. The stakes are obviously very high for immigrant communities, and we've seen among immigrant communities people wanting to get involved. The numbers of applications for citizenship have surged over the past year. There's been a 32% increase in naturalization applications nationwide, comparing this past spring, April through June, with April through June of last year. So 32%. That includes a somewhat smaller increase here in Illinois. I'll talk about why that is, but this trend is nationwide. Immigrant communities are obviously very concerned about the potential for separation of their families. They're concerned about attacks, verbal attacks, even physical attacks, vigilante action. They want to make sure that their voices are heard. Now, my organization, ICIRR, is undertaking our usual biennial program, the New Americans Democracy Project, to register new immigrant voters and turn them out to the polls. So our goal this year is 25,000 registrations and 50,000 voters turned out to the polls this fall. Again, we are a nonpartisan organization. We are not telling anybody how to vote, but we could probably guess how they will. Okay. Now, what's going to happen, after the elections? Again, that's largely going to depend on who wins. So, we could see an alignment in the federal government that could lay the groundwork for another serious push for immigration reform and for legalization, particularly if you see a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, and Paul Ryan continuing on as Speaker of the House. Paul Ryan, by the way, has come out in favor of immigration reform. So the stars could align to facilitate moving that forward. You could also see further shifts in administrative policy, particularly around enforcement and detention. I should have noted earlier that the Justice Department has, is phasing out the use of private prisons, and the Homeland Security Department is undergoing a review process to examine its own use of private prisons. Note again that 2/3 of detention beds being used by ICE are in private hands. So whether they'll be able to, move forward on that without causing major disruption is a significant issue. Now, we ICRR, our allies, our members are all hopeful that we'll be able to, mobilize to move forward on such changes. We realize, though, that even when promises are made, we have to hold elected officials accountable to their promises. So we're not taking anything for granted, even if the stars align. On the other hand, we could also be preparing for a massive acceleration of enforcement activity, and again, even vigilante activity. So we need to we need to be prepared to figure out and implement defensive strategies to protect families from being separated, and which could include things like increasing, accelerating our community education and know your rights education efforts, and even direct action if that's called for. In some ways, this would be a continuation of our response to the raids that happened earlier this year, only much more so. Now, I want to wrap up here by I've mainly been talking about the federal elections, but I should note also there are consequences on the state level as well. Now, obviously, the governor and most statewide elected officials are not up this year, but there are some very key state legislative races that could shift the balance of power between Governor Rauner and Speaker Madigan and the Democrats who control the General Assembly. Now, the states and local communities have been able to create welcoming policies for immigrants, on their level. So, for instance, we have in-state tuition here in Illinois. We have the Illinois DREAM Act. We have driver's licenses. We have same-day voter registration. We've been able, over the past, during this past year, to move forward on a student access bill for undocumented students, and on automatic voter registration, which passed with significant margins in both chambers, only to be vetoed by Governor Rauner. So. And I should note also that one key element in this mix is state funding for immigrant services, which dates back to Governor Edgar, but which unfortunately was interrupted last year by the budget impasse. This is the element that I mentioned, that I was referring to earlier when I noted that the increase in naturalization applicants in Illinois was not as high as nationwide. It was because the infrastructure to assist immigrants with those applications just wasn't there because the state funding was lacking. So we recognize that the outcome of the elections is going to have an impact on not just prospects for automatic voter registration and student access, but also the state budget situation overall. We do have a stopgap budget that's good until December 31st. The General Assembly is going to have to come back after the elections to figure out, okay, well, how do we figure out getting enough revenue to pay for everything we budgeted this year and to sustain programs like immigrant services and all the other programs that we rely on as Illinois residents for years to come. Let me close out here by saying, regardless of who wins or who loses, there's lots of work that we need to do at all levels. First off, supporting local immigrant communities and policies that welcome them, such as the Student Access Bill. supporting local immigrant-serving organizations, such as the Y, and such as the Refugee Center up the street, such as the Immigration Project, which is providing legal representation for immigrants throughout the lower the southernmost two-thirds of the state, helping with citizenship workshops, helping with English classes, helping with voter registration, and trying to meet the other needs that immigrants may have. And then finally, I think it's important for all of us to speak up, tell truth to power, push back against some of the really hateful rhetoric that's happening out there, and project a message of welcome and hope for all, for everybody who's trying to join our community and contribute. So, thank you.
I would like for you to outline what you refer to in the way of these direct actions to these raids recently. I remember hearing about it a little bit, but no great detail. And the other thing is related is we know about ICE raids here lately.
Yes.
Is that an increase or maybe just more reporting? Do you have anything on that? And this throwaway question, if you want to get to it at the end, is you were talking about private prisons.
Yes.
Jesse White was here on the stage, and he pointed out that there was a one-vote loss of a bill that would have gotten rid of private prisons for ICE detainees. The only private prisons that are operated in Illinois. There are no private prisons for regular incarcerates. Right. So that's about.
Okay. So yeah. Okay. What was the first part again? The direct action. Sorry. Okay.
Direct action.
Yeah. Well, in the past, direct actions have included, sit-downs, pickets, blocking deportation buses that are heading to the airport, other kinds of protests. So, I think, protests also taking up specific cases and launching, petition drives and other efforts to raise the profile of these cases. So again, this is what we have done. The degree to which we'll need to continue to do that, well, we probably will need to continue to do this in one form or another. It's just a matter of scale. So ICE raids, we are aware of situations where, particularly in areas where, local authorities are not cooperating with ICE, that there's increasing frequency of ICE agents going into neighborhoods and knocking on, either knocking on doors or trying to apprehend people at their homes, So, I suspect that there is an uptick in that kind of activity, though it may also be just higher profile, compared, for instance, to ICE being able to just pick someone up at the county jail or the local police department, and then. With respect to private prisons, yeah, Illinois does have a private prison moratorium bill that affects correctional facilities and county jails. It does not affect other forms of detention or other kinds of facilities. Back in 2012, I wrote and worked on lobbying the General Assembly to pass a broader, more sweeping ban on privatization of other forms of detention. That would have included immigration detention. That bill, unfortunately, fell one vote short of passing in the Illinois House. Actually, that one vote would have been Naomi Jacobson, the state representative here, except her yes button was malfunctioning. I was in the House gallery that night, so that was probably the worst night of my life that didn't involve a date. Fortunately, private prison fortunately, we've been able to beat back other attempts to build private immigration prisons here in Illinois. Though I should note that there's kind of renewed interest. Last night I was actually in Kankakee County, where another private prison company is trying to woo a local community to, throw in with them to build a facility there. So again, Homeland Security could decide by the end of next month to do away entirely with the use of private prisons. That would make my life easier. Well, part of my life easier. But that's, we'll have to see how that goes. So thank you for your questions. I hope that answered all three of your questions.
Can't you have a revote when you have a technical malfunction?
There was a revote, and unfortunately, the lobbyists for the private prison company got on the phones and flipped some other people. So, yeah, again, the worst night of my life. Okay. Yes. Oh, over here.
So, assuming that Hillary wins the election, what do you think could be like a next logical step for DACA? Because I think a lot of these DACA kids obviously aren't afforded full benefits. Like they can't here in Illinois, like they can't receive federal aid, of course.
Right.
There's a lot of things they can't have, so it helps them live their lives, but it doesn't really. It isn't the whole way.
Right. Okay. Yeah, great question. There are two parts of this. One is that Secretary Clinton has pledged to continue and even expand DACA. It's fairly likely that she would do that. If she doesn't do that, there'll be lots of angry young people who will be tweet storming the White House, to get her to do that. It's also, somewhat likely that again there would be a renewed push for the DREAM Act or broader legislation that would include the DREAM Act. Again, similar to the bill that was considered in 2013. I should note here that quite a number of DACA recipients have been able to gain lawful status because if they leave the United States and then come back with advanced parole, that's considered a lawful admission, and if they qualify for a visa through some other way, say through marriage, they can get their green cards. It's not happening in huge numbers, but it is possible. The other part of my question, and this addresses the student aid issue, I mentioned the student access bill, which is something that I've been working on, and I know leaders here on campus have been working on as well. Now, this is legislation that would, make undocumented students eligible for university-based aid, and provide them at least that opportunity to compete for, for grants and scholarships and tuition waivers and other assistance. Now, it doesn't increase the pool all that much, so it's not as though, it's not as though these students are trying to take anything away from anybody, but they just want the opportunity to be able to, get some assistance to better able afford their continuing education. So that bill has passed the Illinois Senate. It's passed out of an Illinois House committee. We're hoping and we'll be working to get final House floor approval when the General Assembly comes back after the elections. And if anybody wants more information about that, please contact me. I can put you in touch with our organizers who are working on that. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really informative and helpful.
Sure.
I have two questions.
Sure.
The first question is, you said that of the 34,000 people who are detained on any given night, that 2/3 of them are in beds managed by for-profit companies.
Yes.
Is it that the federal government brings those people to those private companies, or is there some way besides lobbying that they can influence the number of people there? And my second question is, given your experience in Illinois, which city in this state is the least welcoming to immigrants?
Oh my. I don't know the answer to your second question, and I'm not going to hazard a guess, so sorry. to the first question, you know, a lot of this is just based on ICE contracting, and I mean, there've been long-standing relationships between ICE and several of these companies: Corrections Corporation of America, GEO Group, Management and Training Corporation, and several other smaller players in the field. And so some of them have just been able to develop the relationships and be somewhat more, hate to say it, more nimble in being able to build quickly and provide the facilities that ICE needs. And you saw this in particular with the family detention centers in Texas, in Dilley, Texas, and Karnes County, Texas, both of which are run by private prison companies, by the way. Dilley is run by CCA, GEO is run by, or Karnes is run by GEO. And actually, I believe it was Karnes that was actually bootstrapped onto another contract for a facility in Arizona. There was such a rush to get that facility going that rather than go through their normal procurement processes, they just bootstrapped onto another existing contract with the same company, which seems kind of skeevy to me, but that's how they did it. So I should say here that the 1/3 of beds that are not operated by private prison companies are generally county jails, which is the case here in the Chicago district, or facilities owned and operated by ICE itself, which there aren't that many of them. So here in Illinois, well, here in the Chicago district, there are 6 facilities that ICE contracts with, and they're all county jails, including one in McHenry County up in the northwest Chicago suburbs. There's one further downstate in Ullen, at the southern tip of Illinois. There are 2 jails in Wisconsin, 1 jail just outside Terre Haute, Indiana, and another jail just outside Cincinnati on the Kentucky side. So, I'm not going to, I'm not going to say that they're any better than the for-profit facilities, but at least nobody's making money off of them. Sure. Okay.
Okay, so instead of which city?
Yeah.
What kinds of laws, besides actively working with ICE, are the least friendly policies that cities can and have passed?
Well, okay, yeah. So there was actually a rash of local ordinances that were being proposed and in some cases enacted by local communities. For instance, it would have prevented landlords from renting to the undocumented, or prevented undocumented immigrants from getting local business licenses. Some of you may have heard of the community of Hazleton, Pennsylvania. That was probably the preeminent example of a community that passed such laws. And actually, the village of Carpentersville, which is just north of Elgin in what county is it in? Lake County. Tried to pass such legislation back in 2007, causing a huge backlash and large amounts of discord within the community. I'm sorry, Carpentersville is King County. Sorry. The ordinance, if I recall correctly, the ordinance ended up not passing. But unfortunately, there were certain elected officials who were trying to basically make political hay by supporting these policies. So, hope that answers the question. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
Please join me. Oh, you want?
Oh, one more? Yeah, that's fine. Hi.
I was wondering, could an immigration reform bill be successfully implemented without having a more secure southern border?
Yeah, that's a great question. The 2013 bill passed the Senate largely because it included provisions, these so-called border surge provisions that would have further, for instance, would have further doubled the size of the Border Patrol. It even spelled out, a whole laundry list of different types of equipment that would be procured, by the Border Patrol and by Customs and Border Protection. So, theoretically, the answer to that question would be yes, it could happen without. Politically, that's a whole nother question. And again, the compromise that was made 3 years ago was to include these provisions, and it's somewhat likely, especially since even if the Democrats can take back control of the Senate, it's going to be by a razor-thin margin. So there will have to be some Republican cooperation, and the Republicans would probably hold out for expanded resources on the border, like it or not. Okay, any more?
Now, please join me in
Okay.
thanking Fred for joining us.
Okay, thank you.